Hello there, good morning. It's 10 o'clock and welcome back to another edition of Front Page with me, Noah Keate. This is a space where every Monday morning from 10, I reflect on the events that have defined the previous 7 days, as well as looking to the future with my imaginary crystal ball to imagine what on earth could possibly happen by the time we meet in the next 7 days. I'll also take a look at all the front pages, all the national newspapers. We'll look at the Daily Mirror on the left, the Daily Express on the right, all the way from the highbrow Financial Times, the slightly less highbrow Daily Star, from every single front page that the BBC have put on their very helpful papers blog. We'll take a look at them, see what they have to say, and analyse what they do say as well as what they don't say about the news and the defining things of our time, because that's what we love to talk about. And don't worry, it won't just be news, as I love to do on this programme. There'll always be a bit of culture. So I've got a book of the week that I think is worth reading. And I know some people sometimes struggle with finding time to read in a busy world. It's very easy to, as I know from experience and have talked about many times before on this show, it's very easy to find time to read online, especially on Twitter or Facebook, but it's sometimes harder to find that time to read an actual printed book or a Kindle version. But one of the only advantages about lockdown is having more time to read. So I'll offer a book that I think is worth reading and I personally got a lot out of. I'll also recommend a podcast that I think is worth listening to. I enjoy listening to podcasts, and I do miss that ability of just going into town, which I'll discuss in a bit, or having that time to go from place to place, which we're always doing far less than having my headphones in, listening to a podcast, always while being very aware of traffic, of course, and stopping at traffic lights. I always adhere to the rules, even though I'm sort of got my headphones in and tuned out on the rest of the world. And I also provide a tweeter of the week, someone who I think is worth following on Twitter. I know that Twitter can be both a wonderful place for sharing ideas, sharing things that are both funny and really informative, factual threads. But I also know that it can be a place for lots of abuse and an inability to disagree well, because while I don't think the world should be defined by people agreeing, that would be both really boring and it would fail to stimulate a debate and move on the conversation. I do think we should be able to disagree with one another in a robust but fair way. So I'll point out someone who I think is worth having on your timelines and having on your Twitter feeds. And if there's one thing I know about doing a politics degree, despite the third term, as we all know, is sadly being cancelled, is that there are plenty of views and different and range of varied opinions about how the world should operate and behave. So, and I'd love to read those in the comments here. I'd love to hear different opinions about what I have to say. You might completely agree with what I have to say, that's brilliant. You might completely disagree. On the other hand, you might think I'm talking a load of rubbish, or you might be just slightly indifferent to the conversation and want to raise another topic that you believe is worthy of attention in this hour that we have together. So whatever your view, whatever your opinion, I'd love to see it on the comment feed. It's brilliant the way this StreamYard system works. I can see all the Facebook and the YouTube comments, and provided it's appropriate, I'll sort of be the censor in deciding what gets read out and what doesn't get read out. But I'd love to hear that as we move through the discussion. And as I know from previous weeks, the hour does go so quickly, and click start, click go live, and before you know it, it's 11 o'clock, time to come off air. But before we do come off air, there's plenty to talk about. And I want to begin today, which, as I'm sure you'll be aware of, we'll be discussing the coronavirus pandemic. Well, there are other stories, and I'm sure they'll be spoken about by Raw News presenters throughout the week. Obviously, the coronavirus pandemic is something that is dominating. It's dominated the news for all the times I've hosted Front Page, and I think will probably continue to dominate the news for many, many weeks and months to come. But I want to discuss today the broad theme of human connection, or rather the lack of human connection. Oh, by the way, before I start discussing that, I should do my time check. Proper radio presenter here. It's 4 minutes past 10 if you're watching this live. It's great to have your company. And I want to discuss and talk about human connection, or as I say, the lack of human connection between us, because for the UK at least, it's been nearly 2 months, can you believe, that we've been in some form of official lockdown. And I won't forget that evening, I think it was a Monday evening, where Boris Johnson said, we are in a lockdown now and you can only go out for these reasons. And going from a state of, being out in the public, used to large crowds in town, at school, at university or wherever, to something that was the complete opposite of that, where every day began to feel like a Sunday. And that being said, they began to feel like Sundays from the past, because even modern Sundays now, shops are still open. Do like to go out and about, but you'd have days during the week where it just felt completely empty, and we'd be very much confined to our individual household with only key workers going out and people going out to shop. Now, it's been fine for me. I've been very lucky. I have a lovely family. We've managed to all handle one another so far, even though we're 2 months into this lockdown. But it has been something really revolutionary and transformative. And the lockdown itself, it's been discussed many times, the merits of it, the limits on our freedom, the ability to go out, but also understanding why the lockdown is in place and why it has to be, sadly, in place to try and contain the spread of the virus, which we are, I think, beginning to see. All the figures and graphs, there'll always be a debate about how true, not how true they are, but almost how reliable they are, with science disagreeing. But I think generally there is across the world a fall, which is something to be really positive about. From this lockdown, I'm always trying to think about the future, about after lockdown, and how humans are going to connect with one person. And to think that even as lockdown is, the restrictions in lockdown are eased further, which I talked a lot about last week, I think we're still going to have some form of suspicion towards other humans. And it sounds awful to say, maybe you've always had a suspicion towards other humans as you walk past them and think, you know, who is this person? What could they possibly do to me? But I think that's going to be even more the case. And it's not just going to be something that we experience when we're walking late at night, in which case, you know, it's an understandable reason why you might be slightly suspicious or slightly on edge, because ideally you want to try and be at home quickly, unless you're the sort of person who for whom midnight walks are the norm and you're used to that sort of thing. I know I'm not. But even during the day, in broad daylight, simply walking past someone else that before we might have either said good morning to, good afternoon to, we're both probably going to try and avoid talking to them and sort of look away from them and regard them as almost less of a human, really, and more of someone that could potentially have the virus and could pass it on to one another. And I think we've really seen that to be the case with the whole debate around face masks, another barrier to human connection. And on that, like most of the science, there are disputes over what works with regards to face masks. You might be more aware of this than I am. If so, do comment down below. I'd love to hear. But from what I've read about it, I think the idea that is that face masks aren't that effective if you don't have the virus, but they're effective if you do have the virus from passing it on to another person. So you may be infected, but if you have to go out for whatever reason, the mask itself might be a barrier. And you can see I'm putting my hand in front of my face. It's like I've already got used to wearing a mask. It might be an effective barrier for at least reducing the chance of being transmitted onto another person. Now, that might be completely wrong. I may have read the incorrect information. So if so, do comment down below what you know. And I'd love to hear about face masks. But as I say, I think it's part of a broader theme of human connection, which is going to be far harder. We have, I think, as humans connected in some way every Thursday evening with the NHS clap and that show of solidarity. I have to admit, I've not clapped every single time. Sometimes I've been on these Zoom calls, which are all getting used to, that hold events in really interesting events in the evening, and that means they coincide with the NHS clap. And other times, I think the National Theatre also they broadcast their shows every Thursday from 7, so that means that it just sometimes doesn't work. But I think even if we haven't been out by our doorsteps clapping every Thursday evening, there has been that sense of inner solidarity, both towards care workers, NHS workers, and all the key workers that are keeping us going. So there has been that sense of shared unity and appreciation. You know, even if we're critical of the broader structures, like there might be bits of the NHS to be critical of, or bits of the transport system to be critical of, I think even if we've been critical of the broad structures, there's been nothing but an appreciation and a thanks and a complete dedication towards those key workers that are going out there. And far from socially distancing from people that might have coronavirus, they're having to get near them, to treat them, to put them on a ventilator and ensure that their safety and their chances of survival are most important. So in that sense, there has been a move towards solidarity, which would be really lovely. But I do think what comes next, what comes after, if it's even possible to say after the pandemic, because I do fear that coronavirus might be something that we simply have to live with for the long term. Is it going to become an equivalent of a swine flu, or where you have to get a flu jab? Do you have to get a coronavirus jab? Is it something that can really be eradicated out of the human system? I don't know. I'd like to think so, but I think in this situation you have to be very realistic about it. So it becomes the case where coronavirus is just like within our daily lives. How are we going to regard other humans? And I think that is really worrying for humanity generally, because, you know, I'm a big supporter of individual freedom, but I think part of achieving that individual freedom is through human connections and socialization with other humans. And we do these through sort of big cultural events. Before Warwick University sadly has shut down for the foreseeable future, I was an event steward at the Arts Centre, and that was a lovely way, whether it's in a studio, at the theatre, in the main Butterworth Hall, of bringing groups together to hear great or slightly mediocre comedians, or seeing brilliant theatre productions or new movements of works of art by independent groups. That art centre, that hub of community, was a great way for individuals to come together as one and appreciate and share their views on a cultural entity. And that's the case of theatres up and down the country that are really struggling. It doesn't even have to be somewhere as highbrow as a theatre, a place like a brilliant restaurant or a good pub like the Dirty Duck. There are also places that we have just we've taken them for granted, whether it's that evening for the SU election results, where we were electing the new sabbatical officers, to just having a chat with someone, a curiosity on campus. They're sort of places not only to enjoy food and drink, some drink more than others, depending on who you are, but also just places generally for humans to come together and share their stories with one another. And I fear that's not going to happen for the long term, whether it would even be in place by September or October when the university term restarts. I'm just not sure about it. And I think that's part of the fear discussing it, is the lack of clarity, the lack of certainty over what's going to happen. And it reflects, I've said before, how governments can never be fully certain over what to do. Part of what they want to do will be guided by scientific advocates who will tell them how the virus is or isn't spreading and how it's developing. But it is obviously politicians who have to make that decision. And part of it, I wonder whether it's just on its sort of subjective human experience. There's a big sort of cliche, I think, towards a gut instinct, in your gut, instinct, what you think is or isn't right. But for some politicians, I think that's all they have to go by when making these decisions, because they don't know. We as the public and those in our workplaces can only go by what we're guided by our superiors. They'll tell us, do this, don't do this, follow this law, follow this restriction, and that will frame much of how we work within the future. And that also links something that I think hasn't been really in the headlines this week, is that it's been in the headlines that people are going back to work. Slowly but surely you're seeing it being slightly busier on commutes. I obviously don't know from personal experience. Looking at videos of buses, they do seem slightly busier than usual, even though it's far from what would be considered normal. But I think while there has been focus on that, there's been far less of a focus on what people actually do when they're in the workplace, and how they ensure social distancing does take place. How do they ensure that people are kept apart? Is that even sustainable for their business in term? So I think while we've had clarity of people going back to work, although you can actually argue whether there's been clarity at all, there has been far less information about what people do in the workplace. And I think, as well as sort of pubs, restaurants, theatres, there have been more sort of cultural events that we've missed out on this year. Part of a year for some people is always guided by a routine. There will always be different fixtures and events that take place that people look forward to. I know for me, last Saturday was meant to be the Eurovision final, and it was sadly the first ever Eurovision to be cancelled since it began in 1956. And so that was a moment of great sadness for me. And while I appreciated the BBC's coverage, I watched some of it on the Sunday morning, they'd done a good effort to try and make up for the lack of performances in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. It wasn't the same as the actual event taking place itself, being with my family, watching it all with our food, commenting on Twitter, and that's just one example of a brilliant music event that gets over 100 million viewers around the world, partially thanks to the presence of Australia in the competition, which I will still never understand, despite their brilliant performance last year. But anyway, this is a news show, not a music show, so I'll be limited in what I say on that. But for other people, as you probably know, sport and me sort of don't go together. We're quite mutually exclusive. But for many people, whether it's football or any other fixtures, that'll be a big part of their shared sense of community. People will regularly go to sporting grounds at the weekend, and even though I personally don't understand the appeal at all, for many people that is their sense of collective community, united by supporting a team, going to the pub afterwards, and that sense of human solidarity. I do get the appeal of Wimbledon, for example. I'd love to go to Wimbledon one year and actually see it live and sit in centre court. I really get the appeal of that. But until that happens, I love being able to watch the competition and watch the performances, see them in their brilliance on the television, and that's going to be cancelled, as are lots of the other Open tennis competitions. But I have heard that there was a Madrid Open that was done virtually, which Andy Murray, I believe, won. So good for him for winning it. But it shows even when something's done virtually, it's not the same. I think it could be a real while before these events, these mass gatherings of people, become the normal, even though we've now been able to meet someone outside our household, one person outside our household. That just isn't the same. And I think it is partially linked to the suspicion we're going to have towards other humans. Anyone that criticises an aspect of the lockdown, anyone that decides to maybe go out a few more times a day that might be deemed acceptable, is seen as sort of heresy and blasphemy for breaking that sort of rule. And I think it's sort of like we look towards humans and see them as people not to be trusted, which I think, as a humanist, that is a real shame. And I know I wrote about this a bit on Twitter last week. I was struggling slightly last week because we have been in lockdown for 7-8 weeks now, and I was just missing the novelty of, I love my family dearly, but I was missing the novelty of seeing people outside my household just to talk to and chat away about the world. I missed the novelty of having a day to myself in town, going to all the different charity shops and looking at their book sections, going and sitting in cafes and the Central Library in Cambridge, watching the world go by. And I did miss those novelties, which, until then I'd taken them for granted when I was back here in Cambridge over Christmas or before I started university in September. And I now appreciate that they may be things that aren't in place for a long time. And I wonder whether it will get to the point that it may be safe. It may be as safe as it can possibly be. As I've spoken about before, we can never live in a risk-free world, and nor should we live in a risk-free world. It may get to the point where it's deemed safe to have these mass public gatherings and these mass events where humans come together. But humans may choose not to. They may choose not to go to theatres and not to go to sporting events and decide to watch it from home, either because they become so used to that, or because they remain fearful of other humans, the viruses that they could carry, what they could catch. Humans remain far more worried for their families and far less attached to that sense of community, solidarity and togetherness, which I think for the future of humanity and the sort of the general future of the human spirit is something that's really worrying. So I think it's something to watch out for, and something that hasn't received so far, I think, loads of connection in the coronavirus debate. But in the future, I'd like to think that humans can come back together, but sadly, the pessimistic part of me thinks that could take rather a long time. Now, it's 17 minutes past 10. I see that lots of you have been commenting along already, so I'll have a read. The CMP movies, hello, good to see you again. I think you've commented on every single one of my front page live streams. Thank you so much. Good morning, Noah. Well, good morning to you too. Morning, says Alex Elbray. Morning, Alex. Hope you're keeping well. Morning, Johnny Jenkins. Brilliant. Hello, good to see you too, Johnny. And Lyra having a cup of tea and listening to Morning Reflections from Spain. Oh, well, it's brilliant to have an international audience listening along. And I hope wherever you are, whatever you're up to in your homes, you are keeping well as can be. And we're going to take our first look now at the papers, see what the BBC screenshots they posted of the different front pages. And we'll start with the Daily Telegraph, the bastion of one of the broadsheets in their printing. It retains it like a broadsheet. It's a huge front page. And they've got on the top of their newspaper silver linings, and they're saying that there are surprising health benefits of the coronavirus lockdown. One of which I suppose is having more time to drink mugs of tea, though I imagine lots of people probably did that in their offices. They probably spend 10 minutes on their break just by the coffee or tea machine. But according to the Daily Telegraph, the health benefits of the coronavirus lockdown is having less junk food, which I suppose, restaurants are opening as takeaways. I know our local fish and chip shop, they're having takeaways, but I could see why people might be making more of their food from home, going out, rushing out to the supermarkets to buy food and choosing to do it that way rather than actually going and having junk food, having takeaways that we might otherwise be used to. Less pollution. Well, clearly, yes, it's one of the few things that have done well out of the coronavirus lockdown is the environment. And I think that's going to really form part of our future debate about wanting to ensure that humans can live fulfilling, meaningful lives in the world, but also that the environment can flourish too. And I don't think it should have to be mutually exclusive, whereas it's sort of presented as a zero-sum game between the environment and humanity. I really don't think that should have to be the case. I think humans should be able to flourish and lead brilliant lives, but so should the environment. And they also say it's more time to cook, more greater sense of community. Well, as I said earlier, maybe community now united against the coronavirus, but after the pandemic is, when it's far less of a threat, I worry about that sense of community or lack of it. More exercise too. Yes, I'm sure there has been more exercise. Like the government have said initially, you could only go out for your leisure was basically going and doing some exercise. I'm sure people have been doing more cycling or jogging. I know I've tried to do my daily jogging, sometimes succeeded, but not always. But their main headline in the Telegraph saying the risk of virus spreading in schools is extremely low. Well, I'm going to talk a lot about schooling after I finish this section of the paper review, but according to the Telegraph, there's a major study that shows there's a negligible, if I can speak, transmission of COVID-19 among pupils and teachers as the World Health Organization plays down the threat. So maybe the suggestion that children are both unlikely to catch the virus and unlikely to pass it on, which would be optimistic for schools reopening. But as I say, we'll probably need to see more information about it. And then the Telegraph also saying quite an optimistic way that a vaccine for 30 million people could be here by the autumn, which obviously would be fantastic. I think there was a real focus on a vaccine being available by September, October 2021 at the earliest. So if that means that it could be here a year earlier, then that is extraordinary. Though, of course, the UK population is more like 65, 66 million rather than 30 million, so it clearly wouldn't serve everyone. The police are going to block entry to crowded trains, report the Telegraph. Well, I heard about this on the radio this morning. Instead of looking at Twitter, I was listening to Radio 4, and they talked about how train operators are aware that the trains are likely to get busier and how they're trying to look at achieving social distancing both at stations but also on trains. And that could mean really a transport nightmare if you're reliant on a certain train and it either doesn't stop at your station because there are too many people on it, or you're just unable to get on it because others have got there first. And for getting to work generally and sort of that morning stress, it could be really tough. So I think employers are going to have to cut their employees a lot of slack in terms of morning commutes because they just might not be able to get on through events outside their control. The Prime Minister has urged to back visiting spots. Well, I mean, that's slightly ambiguous, the headline. Whether they want the Prime Minister to back people visiting or not visiting beauty spots is slightly unclear. I know part of one of the new guidelines introduced last Sunday, which we talked a lot about on last week's show, was there could be unlimited times of exercise a day, and that you could go almost in your car or on your bike to exercise elsewhere, away from the main area in which you live. Nick Timothy has written an interesting comment piece on their headline in the Telegraph. This crisis has exposed devolution as a dangerous mess. Well, it's interesting. Nick Timothy was one of the key advisors, along with Fiona Hill, to the former Prime Minister Theresa May before the 2017 election, and since having to leave after the disastrous election result for the Tories, despite somewhat winning. He's since written columns for The Sun and The Telegraph. And it's really interesting, that discussion of devolution. I can't remember whether I spoke about it last week, but the idea that the advice people in England are following, and Boris Johnson's advice very much for England rather than Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And I think in terms of easing oneself out of the lockdown, there was always going to be a regional approach. It can never be that the whole UK would exit at the same stage. I think we'd mirror other countries like Spain and how we left lockdown. But I think even though we'd leave it regionally and in different ways, there does need to be a central response from Westminster. So in dealing with the pandemic, I don't think that should be, well, health generally is a devolved matter, certainly to the Scottish Parliament and clearly the Welsh Assembly. I don't think it's something that should be, as a pandemic, devolved for the different administrations. I think it's something that should be based at Westminster. But of course, it was under the Conservatives where both the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly were given more powers. And then some world news. Obama lets fly, if I can read that, Trump's take on virus. Well, I saw this, Obama being very critical I think in his address to some graduates graduating this year, and it makes me just feel really sympathetic to graduates across the world who, of course, have had their graduation ceremonies cancelled and not able to have that sense of collective farewell before we go off into the big wide world. And he's been very critical of Donald Trump's response. Certainly Trump saying we will open up whether or not there's a vaccine, being very much quite dismissive of it, really. And as I spoke about before, cynical part of me thinks Trump is being dismissive because the main areas that are being affected are places like New York and Los Angeles, which are places he's never going to win as US president. So from an electoral perspective, he might think, well, the economy matters more than the health of people in LA or New York City. And that's why he's in areas where he's less likely to win votes and more likely to win them in rural areas. So it's really cynical, but something that I think could sadly be correct. The Mirror this morning, they say they're at the heart of Britain. Coming this week, the hottest day of the year. Well, it would never be a proper Daily Mirror front page without a weather story. Well, it does seem like every week there's always a story about it being the hottest day of the year, which, while it can seem nice to people in the immediate and the present, is obviously over a 30-year period a reflection of climate change and how the planet is getting warmer, and we need to find ways to combat that. And that's part of the debate that has to take place. It's one of the many things that annoyed me about the Brexit process. It wasn't so much Brexit itself, but all the other issues that crowded out of the public and political discussion for at least 2 to 3 years. And one of those was finding effective renewable forms of energy that could power the UK and ensure we had energy security for decades to come. And the Daily Mirror, their main headline today saying, are our kids safe or not, Mr. Gove? And this, I think, is to do with an interview Gove gave yesterday during the Sunday morning political shows, where there was a lack of clarity about the level of safety and sort of risk or not facing both pupils and teachers. The top Tory said schools are absolutely safe, but then apparently seconds later he backtracked. But Labour said that test and trace must be in place to ease teacher fears, and it's understandable why people are fearful. You know, parents want their children to be educated, but they want them to be educated in a way where they're going to be safe. The Metro this morning, I think it's brilliant that the Metro is covered despite being a free paper, and I'm sure that they're going through a really tough time at the moment, because I imagine they're mainly picked up, well, it sort of clues in the name of their paper, the Metro at train stations, on the train. That's normally only where I see it whenever going for a day trip to the capital, which sadly won't be happening in the foreseeable future. And the Metro is today saying, I'm making loads of sourdough, tips from the top, and it's a chef or star baker that's using sourdough, obviously plenty more time to make bread or banana bread, which has often been the cliche on social media, but I've not made some of it for a while, unfortunately. And the Metro reporting their warnings over lockdown being lifted too early, and the dangers, really, if it is lifted too early, over what could happen, whether there would be that second peak that's talked about. I think we certainly saw that in Germany. I think they sort of had dealt better with their first wave of the coronavirus pandemic, and so they eased some of the restrictions. And then there was a sense that that all-important R reinfection rate creeped back up to 1, which, as I say, not a scientist at all, but if it's the higher it is, the worse the situation is generally in most circumstances. That's what I am aware of. And then also saying in the Metro that 550 music venues may close permanently. Well, this is deeply saddening to me, but sadly, also deeply unsurprising, really, if they've been unable to receive funds or support to get them through the year. Obviously, they'd be reliant on many ticket sales, great performers, supporting acts, helping to sell out venues. And it's unsurprising, given that they've had to shut their doors, that sadly the financial situation just may be too appalling for them to be able to sort of carry on in a sustainable way. And I think it really creates a debate over what businesses should and shouldn't be supported, because you may have businesses that were loss-making. Indeed, in their early years, many businesses do operate on a loss, but they're able to just carry on, and with the hope that eventually they'll break even. Whereas you'll have others that may have been able to break even financially, but are only just above the level where they can carry on operating. And it does seem unfair where they have been forced to shut by government, or where not attending because of government advice, that these venues should be unable to receive a bailout from government. And I think a general debate around the arts and how the arts, they've helped people during lockdown, really, the arts. Many people are reliant on Netflix or on other bits of television, online theatre, listening to music, really, to get them through the day. And we've been so dependent on arts to help us through this pandemic if we're staying at home. I think that should reflect the broader government and societal appreciation for the intrinsic value of the arts and how it does need to be properly assisted. But the Metro's main headline, getting back on tracks, rail services are ramped up today with 70% of the usual timetable restored in the UK. But having said that, the capacity will be just 10% of the normal level. And they'll be doing that through social distancing, where roads will be left free to people, and that's trying to ensure that, as they say, distancing can be observed by commuters. But despite this, unions fear not enough is being done to protect staff and travellers. So clearly, the role of unions is very much to protect their members, and that's what they'll be aiming to do throughout the process and throughout the time during the lockdown and afterwards, as people go back to work. And I want to begin today by talking about, well, not begin today because we're halfway through the programme, as it's 29 minutes past 10. I want to continue today talking about schooling and the education system, because certainly in the last week I really noticed schools, whether they are going to reopen, really ramping up the political agenda, certainly within the media. And I think we've seen this. I think we have to reflect first that there is a great desire, both from parents and teachers, for their children to be educated. People in an ideal world would love for their children to be in school. Teachers who go into the education system not for the money, because the money isn't brilliant at all. They do it because they have a love for the pursuit of knowledge, and for furthering that knowledge onto the next generation, and for the sort of pursuit of the best academic ideals, nourishing creativity and ensuring that children are safe and well and can learn in a suitable environment. And so they clearly do it through a great ideal, but obviously the coronavirus pandemic has completely transformed that. From the middle of March, schools have sadly been shut. And as I've spoken about before, there's been a real educational disparity in terms of learning, or what learning people are able to access. For some, the online learning will be quite similar to a normal day, really, although I've spoken before about how I think an online learning can never fully replicate face-to-face learning and teacher interaction within the classroom. But for some, you've had something that does resemble that. You've had sessions start at 9, lessons all the way through to 3:30, 4 o'clock. I imagine that's probably the case in private schools, so that schools can justify to the parents why they're paying these extortionate fees that some parents choose to pay. And you'll have something that's fairly similar to a school day that they'd be used to in the actual classroom. But for others, you'll have work that's been sent home, pages and pages of paper, not brilliant. One bit of the environment that hasn't done so well in the coronavirus pandemic, pages and pages sent home of work for them to do, but no sense of sort of teacher interaction apart from maybe an email or an occasional phone call from a head of department or a head of year. And for others, there may have been online learning, but they've not been able to access it. There would have been really nothing. Apart from occasionally a few classes, they might not even have the internet connection or internet facilities to use it. They might not have a computer. There might not be the space for them to learn. And so hence the real inequality that's developed as a result of learning being outside the classroom has developed, because many schools are places where that's the one place where they are safe. They're going to get one hot meal per day. They'll get checked up on. Children will have that sense of routine at school, going from lesson to lesson and being expected to complete work, having those expectations that they might not otherwise have in the home. But I think the need for education is far more than just technical reasons and wanting to support children, but just education itself. It's the belief that children do know English, maths and science up to a certain level, and that transference of knowledge is important. And as well as the transference of knowledge, that personal and social development of children, where they learn to be themselves, learn who they are, develop resilience, develop asking for help and thinking for themselves. That is what the school, that environment, that educational place of brilliance should be about. And clearly they've been unable to access it. And so obviously the usual caveats, in an ideal world, everyone would love to be back in school. I'm sure parents would love to be back at work, or at least have some peace and quiet during the day from their children if they knew they were in the classroom learning away. And teachers would love to be able to be in the classroom dealing with appropriate behaviour, but also transferring knowledge and also questioning children, getting children to be involved in the discussion, which is certainly something that's far harder to do on Zoom. In the classroom, you're able to, I think teachers are able to see who might be struggling, who might need an extra bit of help. But on Zoom or any of these Microsoft Teams sessions, when you have that many people, just those different online connections where only one person can speak at a time. Person speaking at a time is brilliant on this show because I'm the only one doing it, but where in the classroom it's impossible to have that sense of interaction, discussion, debate online that you get in the classroom, which I think is a real shame. And you're clearly seeing, as I say, the disparities from that. And so the debate is about safety. Can teachers be safe, or parents be safe dropping off their children? And what about the children themselves? And as I say, a lot of this is down to scientific evidence, scientific knowledge, but from what I've read, children are both far less likely to catch the virus themselves and are far less likely to pass it on to other people. So in terms of the primary people that are learning, children are, as I say, the least risky or the least at risk when it comes to learning, which I think is really beneficial. Within schools, I think the main people that have to be kept apart are the teachers and the parents. Obviously, both adults, some might have underlying health issues, and so that means that if they were to catch the virus, they'd be far more at risk and far more likely to suffer. And so I think this means that if schools do go back from the 1st of June, it will always have to be in a gradual way, because you'll have some teachers that are simply unable to come in until at least September. They may have underlying health issues. They might be going through chemotherapy. They might have other conditions that, as I've spoken about before, those conditions don't suddenly go away, sadly. During the pandemic, they remain with people. As they may assess that risk, they're not willing to take that risk because they think if they catch the virus, they'll be more affected than someone who's far more normal or just well and healthy. And so that means if you have fewer teachers there, then logically, unless you have big classrooms of people together, not all the students are going to be able to come back at once. And as I don't think I've said this before, but I don't think that big class learning works well. I think far more tailored learning in smaller groups is both more beneficial for teachers who are able to watch over students carefully, and it's more beneficial for students as well, who are able to get that interaction with fewer children and have that teacher attention too. So I think it means until at least September, we're not going to have a full process where schools go back to normal. I think I saw on Twitter that Hartlepool Council have agreed with schools that none will reopen properly until at least September. But at the same time, I understand why teaching unions want to protect their members from being at risk of this virus. That's what they're there to do. If you join a union, you're paying up to have representatives that are there to support you and assist you through thick and thin, whether it's an employment dispute, whatever situation. Your union is meant to be there for you, and I'm a big supporter both of unions and for unions having the right to strike. Even for doctors, I think all individuals should be able to have the right to strike. But having said that, I would like to see more of a can-do approach from unions, trying to work with the education department by saying, we've looked at processes that are taking place across Europe where schools have begun to reopen. How could we mirror those? What strategies could we follow? What does work? What doesn't work? I think the aim of both trying to keep children safe but also educate children should always be at the heart of what forms any discussion about schools reopening or not reopening. I think there also has to be a recognition that schools can never be risk-free. No workplace can ever be risk-free, however many regulations are put in place. When you have a large gathering of people together, whether at the theatre or in the classroom, it's a hotbed for infection. It's chickenpox in young children, flus, the cold, any sort of infection. It's far more likely to pass around when you have young people, and you hear, when people say it's the time of year for a certain sort of bug, and teachers are willing to accept those sorts of risks because they recognise that process of education taking place overrides the risk that they may catch a bug. But again, that links to the coronavirus. It's far more than just a normal cold or a normal flu, as we've seen in the fact that it has become a pandemic. So I think there needs to be a judgment, really, both from head teachers and to what extent they reopen, if at all, but also from parents, because parents might think, well, I'm going through chemotherapy, or my child has had leukemia or a really serious problem. I won't want them going back until at least September in case they catch it or if they pass it on to me. So I don't think the parents should be sanctioned if they decide not to send their children back. But I think the presumption should always be that children will go back, and it should have to be for schools and structures to show why that can't take place, why there can't be effective social distancing, why learning can't properly be enacted. Because we have to remember that from the 1st of June, there are about 7-8 weeks of the academic school term left, and children have already lost 8 weeks already from when schools initially shut, and that's a big time of year from the start of June to the middle or end of July. It's a big time for learning and new knowledge to be developed. So I don't think it should be simply written off. I would say the whole of this academic year is written off and there's no point going about September. I think there is still learning that can take place within June or July, even when that's normally a time for transition and moving on, which is especially important among young people in reception in year one, who would be the first people to go back. And as part of this debate in terms of getting people back, we have to look at not only getting them back in the classroom, but what they learn in the classroom. And I particularly think that this is important for year 10s and year 12s, who I think going through suffering a lot there in the middle of their exam season, with exams due to take place next summer, and yet they'll have lost a huge amount of content. I always have lots of anecdotes about some departments finishing all the content that was needed for exams in sort of the January or the February before exams took place in May and June, and other departments not finishing until the April. It was right to the wire, right at the last minute that we actually finished the content before any revision could take place in classrooms. Well, and as schools teach over the summer, I simply don't see how it's possible for all the content to be learned. Now, I want the exams to take place. I think schools are about far more than simply exams. I think knowledge should be an end in itself, rather than something simply to memorise for an exam that you then do and then forget the knowledge. But I think as pointers to work out what children have or haven't learned, objective testing is important. Because 10s and 12s are going to suffer from not having had all the content time to learn information that they would have had. So I think the debate over education is going to be very important, not only for the current, but also how adults view the system. We have had schools as sort of a universal right for children for over 100 years, really, even though obviously there are inequalities within education and the quality of teaching. But I think it's going to be something that really frames the discussion over what we see education as, and how adults value what children learn, and trying to ensure to children that they both love knowledge, but ultimately can then learn in as safe a way as possible. And that has to be at the heart of great education. Got to have my tea. Right, I want to now recommend my book of the week, which as ever is always out of short. It is How to Be Right, All Gone Wrong by the LBC presenter James O'Brien. And I read this about, I think, a year ago after my exams had finished. And it's a really, I think, insightful and moving read at points. And James, if you don't know him, he's been on LBC, one of my favourite radio stations, apart from Raw, of course. That's above everything else in every way. A brilliant talk radio station. He hosts the weekday morning shows. He'll be on air as we speak. I'm sure you're listening to me rather than him. But so he's been on air for 14 years, and at that time he's done lots of conversations with callers phoning in about topics of the day, and he always turned this into a book in a way. And he's looking at lots of talk show hosts get people to phone in and say what they think, whereas James has been more focused on callers phoning in and asking them why they think what they think. And it's sort of it seems bizarre, but that's almost a new phenomenon in talk radio, which is based on phone-ins. Instead of simply letting people have a say, James is trying to base his shows on challenging people and going under the sort of main assumptions that people may talk about political correctness or their views on a particular religion. But he tries to question and interrogate people on what their opinions and why they think their specific views. And it's structured in an interesting way. I'll just look at the contents page to make sure I get it right. He structures it around key topics that will have occurred in his shows. It may have been in the morning's papers, and that will form 1 hour of his 3-hour show that he does. So likely a different topic each hour. So they're on things like Islam, Brexit, LGBT rights, feminism, Donald Trump, the age gap. And so the way he's done it is that he's taken each of these topics and written both his own musings about the topics, but also inserted in transcripts of his conversations with callers. So he might say, why do you think that? And it's trying to unpick words and views that callers have been able to say really without challenge, really, or they've read without challenge. And, to have the confidence to phone into a national radio station, it's something I'd love to have the confidence to do, but it takes quite a lot of courage and determination to be willing to do that. And so even when they had the courage to phone in, he's willing rather to challenge them and make it clear that what they say isn't just going to go unchallenged, and he's going to sort of frame their remarks. And he spoke a lot. I watched some videos and interviews he'd done about the book, and he spoke a lot about one caller who was a big supporter of Donald Trump. And every time James pointed out why Donald Trump was both an unfit president and a bully, the caller would simply say fake news, fake news, fake news. Even when it was objective, clear things that were on camera that Donald Trump had done, the caller simply wasn't willing to believe that he'd done those things, like mocking a disabled journalist, or all the various comments he's made about women, or even saying, I could shoot someone in Fifth Avenue and I wouldn't lose a single vote. Even on all those things that Trump has said, the caller simply referred to them as fake news. And James, he doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but he does think it's important that we interrogate these propositions and the willingness to believe certain things without looking further into the information. He describes himself as a liberal talk show host, and I definitely put him more on the left of the political spectrum rather than the right on lots of, mainly on social issues. He has very socially liberal views, as well as believing in the importance of the state as a mechanism to sometimes help people. So on economic matters, he's definitely not a free marketeer. And I found it a really riveting read. I don't agree with James and everything, whatsoever. I would have voted Remain like James, I've been able to. But he was a big supporter of the second referendum, which I never supported, and I didn't think it should ever happen. So there are, I don't have to agree with him as a host or, enjoy his presenting style completely to appreciate that he's both a sort of candid, insightful, really thought-provoking presenter, and he ensures that his listeners almost do learn more in a way, whether it's the listeners calling in or listeners that are listening along to the radio. He ensures that they know more about the subject by the end of the hour at the start, and that's really the case in this book. I think he's writing another book at the moment called How Not to Be Wrong, which is a good sequel to this, and I think it's a bit more of a nuanced take on things that he may have got, I don't know fully, the things that he may have got wrong in life and how he moved on from those and try to reassess his own opinions, and that should be coming out in the autumn. So when he's not doing his show every weekday morning, I'm sure he'll be writing this in his spare time, probably having more time to do so rather than having to endure the commute into central London each day. So as I say, it's about 200 pages. It's not, it's complex, but it has the transcripts which are really interesting, and alongside his own views, which when you only have a 3-hour show with ad breaks every 15 minutes, there simply isn't time to get all of his own views and opinions in there. So they're more reflected in the book, and I think it's really admirable that he found time to write this around the time of Brexit, as well as doing a daily show. So good for him. Really worth your time. Great read. Whether you agree with him on everything or not, you will read this book. Well, you may not read this book, but if you read this book, you will leave it knowing more than you did at the start of the read. So I'll put that back down here. And let's take a look at more of the newspapers. It's already 11:15, can you believe? And I've talked about 2 of the 8 topics I wanted to discuss today. So as I say, I ramble on a lot, but I love my ramblings. The Eye today, as I say, always have a very busy front page, given that they're a sort of tabloid side paper. They have an exclusive saying that the Prime Minister's virus safety inspections at work don't exist, with MPs and union chiefs accusing Boris Johnson and public over workplace health and safety as the lockdown eases. Well, that is really worrying, and I think it again raises the extent of what should be decided by the public and what should be for individual companies to decide, and what should also be legislation of what companies simply have to do. What else have they got there? I'm taking in the sights of Tokyo without leaving the sofa. I think it's been brilliant how many companies have had to evolve to moving more of their content online and dealing with online content that they may not have been able to invest in before and not innovate in, but have been forced to if they want to remain relevant when we're all at home rather than experiencing something like Tokyo in person. Ian Birrell, brilliant columnist, saying the rich list reveals what is wrong with Britain. Yes, I think the Sunday Times revealed their rich list yesterday. James Dyson of Dyson Vacuums topping the rich list. I'm not a massive fan of what he does, but in a way, good for him if you're able to be that rich. But yeah, definitely reveals stark inequalities with many billionaires. The Times today, tough quarantine plans, scuppers holiday hopes. If you have to self-isolate 14 days after going abroad, that really is going to limit what you can do, with lorry drivers making up the bulk of those exempted from quarantine rules. So it's as though if you're in a lorry across Europe, you won't have to go into isolation. But yeah, it's been really interesting to read about whether holidays over the summer period, like the middle of end of July, middle of August, can take place. I have something booked in the early part of August, which I hope can take place, but we'll just have to see how it develops. And I think, unfortunately, while you will see probably a boom in domestic UK tourism, which is brilliant, that ability to go abroad and enjoy another country is going to be limited for quite some time. And then the Times also deal with what the Telegraph have, with the UK wanting 30 million doses of vaccine in 4 months. Well, it's brilliant we can get that, but whether we can get it is, of course, another matter. Daily Mail today saying half Britons could get jab in months. 30 million COVID vaccine doses will be ready by September if the trials are successful. So it's very much conditional if the trials are successful. I think some are taking place at Oxford University of people willingly having a vaccine dosage inserted. But yeah, whether it works or not is, of course, another matter, and something we just don't know, which, as I spoke about earlier reflects that sense of speculation and that lack of clarity, which has always informed part of our lives, but we're really quite literally seeing this during the pandemic. Daily Express, they also talk about the 13 million vaccines by autumn, as well as saying lockdown, what lockdown, 81 Fahrenheit, which I don't know because I always use Celsius measurements, saying hottest day on the way this week. So they have their exclusive, well, like the Daily Mirror really, and then some article about northern comedians. Which I don't know much about. The Financial Times today warning that the US recovery could take until the end of 2021. Well, I think that could be very evident and really the case. Even if the UK hadn't gone into lockdown, we'd adopted more of a Swedish approach where people voluntarily maintain social distancing rather than have the state imposing it on them. I think we would have definitely suffered from the world economy collapsing. We have entered a recession. I wouldn't be surprised if that sadly turned into a depression. And there's been a real lack of awareness about how we're going to need to reboot the economy if we want to even get back to where we were in January this year, which in itself wasn't a brilliant place. We were already in loads of debt, very low productivity, little sense of innovation. But I worry that we are really going to suffer as an economy and as a world economy after the pandemic begins to reduce in its severity. And I worry that a lot of the economy being successful is based on entrepreneurial spirit, people being willing to take a risk and think that their business could succeed or it could fail. And I fear that spirit that's so essential for the economy doing well could be stifled because people think, other people aren't going to shop here, they're not going to take that risk, and so therefore people won't take the initial risk of starting up a company which could operate on a loss for many years. But it's about that determination to go through the losses and hopefully break even eventually. But that doesn't look like it's going to happen according to the Financial Times, certainly at least if the recovery in the United States, which is the leader in how the United States operates, will affect how the world economy operates. If that doesn't happen, then we are going to be in for lots of trouble. The Guardian today, ministers are under fire amid chaos over contact tracing, where they're being accused of misstep after misstep last night after applicants become contact tracers for the NHS virus tracking system. We're told recruitment was on hold. And that isn't brilliant. I mean, there are always going to be administration errors, whether or not we're in a pandemic or not, whether or not we're in a pandemic. But it doesn't exactly inspire confidence if it's clear that there's just been complete chaos. And then virtual cycling, whether e-bikes can carry Britain back to work. Well, that could be the case. I do try and cycle occasionally, but I'm not a brilliant cycler. The Sun today, take that exclusive, back for good causes. Robbie Williams apparently is rejoining for a charity gig. Well, it'll be reuniting in their virtual form. But all I say about Take That is, you can try and do your new songs, but I don't think you're going to rule the world. And the Daily Star, finally, Harry will pay up. Harry and Meghan paying up, I think, is it for Frogmore Cottage? They moved initially to Canada and then to the United States, I think to California. It's very nice we can get it, but it'll apparently be 11 years until the cash of their cottage is repaid. According to the Star, they'll start paying back 2.4 million in taxpayer cash they spent doing up their posh cottage. After the Daily Star apparently demanded that they cough up. Well, it shows their influence as a paper. If it was as a result of their pressure that the money was repaid, but it will take over a decade to get all of our cash, and then some other celebrity stories. I mean, it's always really interesting seeing what's on these newspaper front pages because it demonstrates how severe or not a particular story is. And the story is really severe. It's the sort of thing that will cover all the papers, every single one from the FT to the Star, all the way through universally. And that was certainly the case last week, where it was all about the Prime Minister's address. But we're seeing far less of that here, really. There is a bit more variation. I don't know whether that's something to be reassured about, but it shows a sense of going back to a kind of normality where you have newspapers being more variable in their stories, or whether it shows that they're not scrutinising the government enough. The government still deserves scrutiny. We are still in this pandemic. And the idea that we're out of this pandemic and we're out into this new world, I think, is something that's both naive and deeply incorrect. Johnny Jenkins commenting, saying he went to James O'Brien's book launch. It was a good book, but he gave little platform to other views, I think. I suppose his opinion is what makes his show. Well, it's like that on LBC. It's very much, they adhere to Ofcom rules, certainly during election campaigns. The presenters don't offer their opinions on the party and saying you should vote for this party. But the way they achieve their Ofcom balance is by having balance throughout the day. So you'll have maybe more right-wing presenters like Nick Ferrari at breakfast or Ian Dale, presenters that you deemed more liberal, like James and Brian, and then Sheila Fogarty in the afternoon. And so it's by achieving that balance throughout the day rather than within each show that they adhere to the Ofcom rules, which I think is quite good. It's the fact presenters being, they're open about their views, but they're also open and willing to be challenged about their opinions, and have other callers phone in, maybe occasionally be proved wrong if that caller is an expert. And I think it's one of the brilliant things about phone-in shows. You never quite know what's going to be on the other end. Obviously, you can dump a caller if they say anything actionable or libelous, but generally they try and dump callers as little as possible and allow what they say to go out on air, which I think is both brilliant and terrifying in equal measure. And the CMP movie says just go on holiday in England. There's plenty of fun things to do here. Well, I quite agree. I know as a family, we often didn't go abroad I haven't been abroad that often. We mainly holidayed by the seaside or by exploring different cities. That was a key part of my childhood, whether it was the lovely Norfolk coast or going up to York for a holiday, down to Bath, holidaying in London, or Stratford-upon-Avon near Warwick University. A lot of my holidays in the UK were defined by being exactly in the UK rather than overseas. And I think that's not a bad thing, whether it's because of financial reasons for many or simply a desire to explore areas that you shouldn't just be explored by tourists from overseas. I think there's so much to see inland before exploring the rest of the world. Although I've been being a bit cheeky, looking at sort of cruise holidays overseas. I do have an idyllic aim to go on some, maybe not a cruise, but a travel holiday where you're escorted round by a brilliant tour. You get to meet new people. The itinerary is sorted. That would be my sort of dream holiday in a way, where it's just the routine is decided for me rather than myself having to decide which attractions to visit and which ones are worth avoiding. But before I offer my final cultural recommendations today, because if you can believe it, it's 10:55, I've only got 5 minutes to go before I have to come off there. Before I offer my final cultural recommendation, I want to have a bit of positivity, really, and that is that borders within Europe are starting to be relaxed, not completely, but I read earlier that borders in Germany, France and Switzerland, where they're completely, almost at a complete deadlock, where the Schengen area have completely closed, they have been relaxed slightly, and I think Italy are also going to relax their borders too from the 3rd of June. So as I say, while there should be much optimism and excitement, it's clear that things are gradually, fingers crossed, I don't believe in any of that, but they're slowly improving and slowly getting better. So I think that is something to feel good about, at least. And we have to try and find the positivity. I support, being realistic about things, and broadcasters and newspapers telling things as they are. But at the same time, I think a dose of optimism isn't anything bad. I think it's almost essential for a meaningful and enjoyable life. Now, my final cultural recommendations for today, which, as ever, I think I'll never get round to squeeze. I think they'll always be squeezed in at the end. I'll never find a way to have them in early and have a more organised show. So I do apologise, and also don't apologise for that, because it's what might make this show slightly unique. My podcast of the week is a bit of a cheat this week, which I'm going to recommend Raw's very own Eurovision Lockdown Semi-Final 1 podcast, which was brilliant to record. I was part of it. There were 9 judges. We recorded it a couple of weeks in. The way we did it was that we listened to each of the songs, in a chat, the first 17 that were in the first semi-final. We rated them, gave our opinions on them. It was brilliant. Some songs were spectacular, other songs were completely dire, and some, worst of all, were mediocre. If you're going to do Eurovision, either be brilliant, please, or terrible. Nothing in between is what we want. But it was really great to record, chat to some new people as part of the Raw team who are all just fantastic. We should hopefully be recording the second one imminently, if Zoom learns to behave itself. We had a really great 3 hours actually trawling through them, and it didn't ever feel boring, because each song was so different in its sort of own unique way, a different personality and a different style. And so I really recommend finding that. You can find that by going on the Raw Mixcloud account. I didn't know about Mixcloud until a few months ago, but you go on there and it has both the Eurovision Lockdown podcast, which I really recommend, 2.5 hours of your time, and also all the other great shows, music shows and speech shows that we do, which are really worth listening to. And my tweeter of the week, it's Alex Wickham, who used to be the political editor of BuzzFeed UK. And I say used to be because, unfortunately, in the last 7 days, BuzzFeed announced that it was ceasing the vast majority of its UK and Australian operations. Now, this may seem quite silly. You might think of BuzzFeed as a site for funny quizzes and lots of clickbait articles, but its news output was seriously impressive. It had a brilliant but small team covering political issues within the UK at BuzzFeed, and their headlines, maybe some were occasionally a bit of a clickbait style, but the actual stories themselves were really, really top quality. They broke lots of exclusives. They were really informative in the way that they wrote articles. It didn't dumb them down, but they were read in an easy to understand way, and it was clear what they were trying to convey and what story they were uncovering. And Alex Wickham, particularly as political editor, was a real sort of star, both in his tweets promoting his stories and in the stories themselves. And they were a really, really great team. It's sort of deeply saddening. I think BuzzFeed simply couldn't get the advertising revenue of compared to companies like Google and Facebook, which it really relied on. So it made the decision, I think it's a US company, so it made the decision to focus on its US output at the expense of having to cease most of its UK and Australian operations, which is a real shame. I think the only advantage is that all the political journalists are so great that they'll hopefully, again, fingers crossed, be snapped up by other companies ASAP, because we deserve their reporting and we deserve brilliant journalism. Now, can you believe it? It's 10:59, so we've come to the end of the show today. Thank you so much for your company and comments. It's been great to hear from different people throughout the show, read out your remarks and hear what you have to say. If you haven't had enough of me, I'm going to be on Raw News again today from 3 p.m. I'm going to be on Insight, hosted by a fantastic head of news, Enoch, where we'll be discussing some of the news stories I've discussed and also plenty more. He's got a whole range of exciting topics on offer. But I really enjoyed the discussion. It's been brilliant to sort of escape from lockdown through our conversation and hear what you have to say. So thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you stay well. It'd be lovely to see you again next week here, same time, same place from 10 a.m. But just remember, front page, in or out of lockdown, it's the place to be. Goodbye.